Syd Barrett is an odd character in rock music history. He was the co-founder of the legendary rock band Pink Floyd and decided to leave the band early on despite massive success in the UK and neighbouring countries. In parallel with their early success and fame, Barrett developed an erratic behaviour that people often linked up to his heavy use of LSD. He stopped showing up for gigs, TV performances, and overall lost the spark in his eyes. The once creative leader, songwriter, and all-round charismatic spirit of Pink Floyd turned into a completely different person. Now, the rest of the members in Pink Floyd have multiple times mentioned how they wanted the best for Syd, but that they were blinded by their pursuit of success. Waters, Gilmour, Wright, and Mason were obviously young, disciplined musicians that were hungry for success. They wanted to leave their mark on music like so many others. Since Syd became an unreliable band member by the late 60s, they had to let him go in order to function as a more professional and prolific band. We know for a fact that Syd agreed to leave the band on April 6, 1968 on good terms. As a matter of fact, he still had contact with the members of Floyd up until 1970, but during those few years, Barrett became a different person. Whether it was due to his use of LSD or the pressure from early fame is uncertain. But there's one song in particular that captures this transition perfectly.
It's awfully considerate of you to think of me here, and I'm most obliged to you for making it clear that I'm not here.
What you just heard is Jugband Blues, the last song that Syd Barrett wrote and released with the band. Surprisingly, despite his ever-growing detachment and inability to communicate with the other band members, the lyrics display a sense of clarity and self-awareness. Syd was still a living, breathing artist by this point, and like so many artists, he probably communicated most clearly through his songs.
And I'm wondering who could be writing this song.
As you can see, Barrett questions who wrote the song, and although it's pretty clear that he wrote the song himself, it makes you wonder why he would write such a thing to begin with. One of the effects of LSD is something called ego death. This is where you experience that you no longer exist, at least not in the way you normally understand it. You and the rest of the world melt together in something that can feel like a near-death experience, or an extremely liberating experience. And so if every person in the world is connected, who wrote the song? Now, if it isn't a reference to his LSD experiences, it might just be a sign of his growing insanity.
I don't care if the sun doesn't shine, and I don't care if nothing is mine.
This part of the lyric is really interesting. The sun don't shine part might refer to the fact that he's feeling himself losing touch with the world. As fellow band member Richard Wright pointed out in an interview,
it was clearly much more serious than we thought it was, because he couldn't respond, he couldn't communicate, he couldn't do anything in form and terror. And the biggest change for me, his eyes. He's had so much life in him, and then his eyes just went dead.
Syd lost the light in his eyes. He was even aware of it, but let it happen because of his ever-growing apathy. Roger Waters later incorporated parts of that phrase into a song dedicated to Syd, Wish You Were Here's Shine On You Crazy Diamond.
Remember when you were young, you shone like the sun.
Now, as we're talking about that album, personally, I just want to say I'm a much bigger fan of Wish You Were Here than The Dark Side of the Moon and The Wall. It just felt like a much more down-to-earth and personal record, in my opinion. Plus, my listening experience was probably colored by several walks to the beach. For some reason, beach trips and Wish You Were Here was the most epic combo as a listening experience to me at the time. Yeah, I don't know why.
Now there's a look in your eyes, like black holes in the sky.
In a way, Syd Barrett didn't only propel the band to fame during the early years. Much of their most famous work during their post-Syd years were also thematically connected and inspired by what had happened to him. As you just heard, Wish You Were Here is an album that partly tackled the theme of losing Syd. Dark Side of the Moon deals with the pressures of society, something that Syd definitely felt after his sudden rise to fame. And not to mention The Wall, an album that partly tackles the theme of isolation, a reference perhaps to how Syd became more reclusive as time went on. Now, going back to Jugband Blues, the music in the song is equally as interesting as the lyrics. Off-kilter rhythms break apart over the sound of a simple acoustic guitar. Oddball instruments drop in and out of the soundscape, and around the 1 minute mark, a triumphant group of instruments come marching in. And all this ends in Syd Barrett's la 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 la. And this is where the song does a left field move. And before you know it, it turns back to a somber and more stripped down version of the beginning.
And the sea isn't green, and I love the Queen.
Just like Syd Barrett, this song has a tragic story with a beginning, middle, and end. Syd started out as a promising and original star, but he burned out too soon. He tried to escape his trouble by taking LSD, leading to his mental decline. And this is the reason why I find this song so beautiful, sad, and haunting at the same time. It symbolically sums up everything that Syd went through as he was going through it. Now, the reason why I wanted to bring up this song and this story, besides it being really interesting in of itself, is because it's quite similar to what's constantly happening to rappers these days. Lil Peep died of a fentanyl and Xanax overdose back in 2017, and Juice WRLD died last year from a seizure that's believed to be connected to his drug abuse. Now, obviously, there's major differences between drugs like LSD and fentanyl, and I'm by no means educated enough to go in depth on the differences. I still want to draw a comparison though. Syd Barrett did the same thing modern pop musicians still do today. He tried to escape from his daily stressors and responsibility. Now, people didn't know as much about psychedelics, drugs, and mental health back then compared to what we do today. Today, we have a lot more information right at our fingertips. So if you're exposed to these kinds of topics in your own life, try to educate yourself. If you're struggling mentally, you should by all means seek professional help. And it's a shame that there's still so many artists that have made it popular to quote-unquote self-medicate today, because in the worst case scenario, it leads to an early death. So that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I always try to take into consideration what artists and bands you want me to talk about by looking at your suggestions in the comments. But if you consider yourself a super fan of my channel, then consider checking out my Patreon page. Patreon is a membership site that makes it easier for creators to get paid. And for just $1, you'll get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content that I don't share anywhere else. Now, what's even more exciting is that once I hit my $150 goal, which we're very close to hitting, by the way, I'll make a video completely based on suggestions from my supporters. So just click the link below to sign up today.